Welcome to the second podcast. This one's called Remodelling Existing Buildings, which is an absolute key skill for anybody that deals with the kind of interiors. And so before we start getting into it, I've just been joined by Paul Harries. So Paul, if you want to give a quick introduction to yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So I'm Paul Harris. I taught on the interior architecture course some time ago now. Currently, I'm a practicing architect, director in a firm called BCHN. I'm also head of a small school of architecture in Swansea, and we just launched our part two, if anyone's interested out there.
Cheers, Paul. Interior architecture was my degree. I did a master's in fine art, but I was very interested in how you can integrate artworks into the kind of existing building fabric. My PhD kind of pushed that a bit further and started to get more involved in kind of user response and emotional responses to kind of spaces. I taught interiors for 20 years. I was a practitioner for 18. So I'm very much interested in how spaces and places kind of make us feel. And I've recently set up Interior Design Evolution. So just a kind of disclaimer. So the podcast is going to show a series of case studies in a minute. It's not trying to map out all the scene for remodeling existing buildings because it's actually a very big subject. So we've just selected a series of projects that we will talk through. So if I share screen. Okay, so just to start off, the idea really about remodeling existing buildings, what we call the kind of host building. Ultimately, what you need to do is to analyze that host building. All the key features and characteristics of that host building and the site are one of the first things that we do. Then we have our design ideas, so the response to the client brief, client needs, all those things. And those two things come together to create that design strategy. So it's the ideas and that building to create that strategy. So ultimately, remodeling existing buildings should benefit the client stakeholders, but also the community, society, and culture. So everyone. So there's a continuation with a host building in a city or town. It's been there for a certain amount of time. So it has a history, and it's how then you take that history on. So, and it's always a balancing act between what you retain. So there's a preservation and, conservation kind of angle to it, maybe. What you restore, repair, kind of renovate, refurbish, or replace like for like, or what you remove, where you intervene, where you make changes and alterations. So we've mapped this thing out on a kind of spectrum. So on the kind of left-hand side here, there's the kind of high value kind of architecture, things like kind of churches, sacred listed buildings, things that are historically or aesthetically important and sort of demand respect. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there's the kind of lower kind of value sort of architecture, and then it's more like a kind of blank canvas. And so it's, the building features and the surfaces can be concealed or removed. And then there's all the stuff in between that, which have, buildings that may have, some historic or aesthetic interest in spaces or features that could be retained or restored into that future venture. So we will talk across that spectrum through 3 projects. So we'll go into those in a kind of conversational way between myself and Paul.
I think what's quite interesting about it as well, Craig, the 3 buildings that are selected is that you could also think of kind of one which is maybe dominated by architectural ideas moving towards interior, whereas the other one is perhaps at the lower end, sort of interior ideas moving back to spatial strategy. It's just a prelude to the kind of conversation that we might have as well in relation to the strategies that are embedded in these.
Yeah, so this slide is all to do with the kind of host building, and then with your ideas that build the strategy, then you need to think about how you can combine and integrate those ideas within the old historic kind of fabric of that house building. And there's a number of words that we can use here. And, we can talk about an insertion, which is basically something that is inserted or installed within that kind of building on the one kind of side of the spectrum. And then on the other one, there's more of a kind of new lining, which prioritizes the new things and maybe conceal or even reject the kind of old, features. And then there's lots of stuff in between that where they may be, you coexist or integrate, or you make an intervention. So you're looking to kind of seamlessly kind of build your kind of project within that host building. And again, we will show and have conversations about three different projects. So the insertion on the one end through to the kind of new lining that kind of moves away from what you see in the existing building, because the new lining becomes the interior, and then all the stuff kind of in between. The excitement, I suppose, is all that kind of blue area, because it's quite vast in that middle section. So we'll move through these kind of 6 projects. So we'll start top left. So we'll start with something which is a high architectural value, this church, and they put a bookstore and cafe into it. So it's very much a kind of insertion as the main kind of idea. So there's the kind of house building, 13th century kind of church. And you can see this huge kind of inserted kind of bookcase on the left-hand side image. Paul, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting example because, as I mentioned before, it's what things might you bring from what you might think about as, architectural practice into the world of interior design, and what might come up, if you like, from the world of interior design into architectural practice, and the kind of coexistence or the dialect between those two things. I mean, this is clearly, it's like on one hand, as Craig says, it's like a giant piece of furniture, but it also is at a scale which kind of resembles a building as well. And it's sat very clearly within the space, although you'll see in the plan that this object does encapsulate the columns as well. So it isn't entirely sitting free of structure. I mean, notionally it's free of structure because the columns kind of run through it in a series of voids, but it's embedded onto the structure in that sense. But it's of huge scale. You'll see it's like a 3-story intervention in that space there. And the thing that makes it work in terms of the host building is it has this kind of quasi independence of it. The main decision I would suggest is the positioning of this thing is the key to it, and also the fact that it follows the grain of the nave of the church, so it kind of follows the kind of spatial condition of the church, which is a clear kind of axial grain. It's set to one side, and it's absolutely defined clearly as an object, trying not to interfere as much as possible in one sense with the fabric, although obviously it clearly reconfigures the space.
And also, Paul, I think immediately on our first case study here, you can see that there's a couple of strategies here. There's the strategy of the big insertion, which is you can see on the kind of section, it's running right the way up the building, but it's set to one side to create space so that you can enjoy the space. But also there's another strategy of the lower level things, and there's certain things which you'll see on a couple of different slides that actually almost integrate into the architecture a bit. It's still separated, but it's up against it. So there's the plan.
The plan's interesting because, one of the things that you'll all recall, I'm sure, from doing the interior architecture was a building analysis, which might start with structure. So what kind of rhythm does the structure have? What kind of bay system might be within a building? So clearly, because these are objects which are kind of pierced or spiked in the space, for want of a better description, by the columns, then they automatically then confer a kind of rhythm onto the object. And that rhythm obviously then clearly relates to the structure, although when you see it at first hand, perhaps in the perspective view, you might not quite get that ordering of the rhythm, but it's very, very clear on plan.
So there's this kind of this huge structural object. So you can see bottom left, which you'll see in a bigger image in a second, that there's a huge JCB in here digging up the floor. I'm not quite sure where it was at the start, where the project started, but clearly, there's a new floor put underneath this and structure to kind of hold it kind of in place. So as you can see now, that structure, as Paul was describing, that is kind of marching through the space, but it's leaving the columns. You can see on the left-hand side, there's an aperture where the kind of columns, are passing through this structure.
It's quite interesting, the shot of the floor, actually. I don't know, I'm not familiar enough with this project to know why the floor has been taken up, whether that's some sort of archaeological excavation or there's some construction issue that they want to undertake, and they've removed that floor. But you can see that what has been put back in is a very kind of pristine new floor. And perhaps on more recent schemes, there has been a kind of move to what you might call slightly more unfinished approach, and some of that original floor may have been retained in some way. As I say, I'm not entirely sure for the reasoning behind the removal of that floor. It seems to have been put back in, from what I can tell, at pretty much the same grade as when it was taken out. So it was just a kind of decision made on the basis of condition. I can't really tell. But obviously, the insertion of the new floor has a huge kind of transformational effect on the existing space. It must have done. There's no photos. I don't know if you've got any photos of what it was like before, Craig, but
Uh,
um, it's
it's
looks like a very highly polished finish.
Yeah. I mean, this is pretty much taken from the same angle. So you can sort of see that, obviously the huge kind of, insertion of the kind of bookcase that, takes you all the way up to enjoy the kind of architecture and all the kind of murals up above. So it takes you up in that space, which is very unusual in churches and cathedrals. You never get up into that space. So it's quite an exciting, dynamic kind of move. But because they've stepped it to the one side, you can see most of that space. And so even the bits you can't see, you imagine, your brain fills in the gaps. So you enjoy the kind of whole space. And on the photograph on the kind of, the right-hand side, you can see the other strategies as well. So you've got the big, you know, three kind of story kind of strategy, but then you have these lower level elements and then some almost integrating back into the architecture. So all projects will have a series of different strategies. Very rare just to have the one strategy.
I think the color choice is quite interesting as well. It's a big black object, or at least the steel frame is black. Of course, what kind of dominates it in the end is the color of the books. You can see there that it kind of picks up the rhythm of the church, although the line of the access routes give it a really strong horizontal grain as well. You can also see it kind of completely obscures really the columns on the other side, particularly from this projection, but they have left some end bays completely free. Otherwise, you would not have kind of got any feeling of the quality of that space. So if they'd run the linear object straight down the nave of the church, then you wouldn't get that feeling of the space kind of running around the object, as it were, and seeing those end bays.
And building the lighting in, I think, is an interesting thing as well. So you put the object in and then you add lights to it, not only to light itself, but to light the space, which is quite cool. There's another shot looking across. So the model, you can see, what Paul's talking about there is, if you build this insertion right the way from end to end, then you start to lose the space. So, that modeling to make sure that you see the end column here and the arch, and then your brain makes up the rest of the kind of space.
It's interesting, the model, Craig, it seems to have sort of like kind of cutouts
Mm.
within the black panels, but they don't seem so evident in the photographs. I don't know, is that something that's still got through to the final scheme? It's hard to tell.
Well, it's interesting because obviously the bookstore here wants a certain amount of kind of shelves to make the correct amount of sales, and so that's also given the kind of verticality of this thing. So you go up and there's a series of floors rather than building one floor right the way across, as lots of schemes do, and the kills the kind of space. So yeah, it's interesting. I didn't notice that. And there's some shots right on the top layer looking down, so you're going up and enjoying the kind of murals. And then there's the other lower level strategy on the right hand side, where you can see some of it's kind of integrated back into the kind of architecture.
I think one of the great things about that scheme is it just allows you to get up quite close to those
Yeah.
fantastic ceiling of the church, the stone ceiling with its vaulting.
Okay, cool. So that's up on the top layer as well. So you go through the kind of arch and back through into the kind of smaller side spaces. And then built in is the kind of cafe where the kind of altar space was. So you can see the huge table in the middle where the altar would be. And assuming that this can be fairly easily removed because it's not quite touching, you can see the lighting around the edge of it. But again, it's a slightly different strategy to the big kind of insertion. This thing kind of sits back in and it's integrated into the space.
I think that's a really important point you raised there, Craig, is that within this kind of building, which, would be of a kind of ancient monumental listed status, that everything that's put in is usually reversible, i.e., it could all be taken back out again and the existing building would be there. So when you're kind of dealing with a host building like this, there are very strict limits on exactly what you can do. So they're not physically intervening with the fabric very much, as far as I can tell. But obviously, they're putting quite a big insertion into the space. But that could be dismantled and removed at any time should they choose in the future.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the kind of next. So this is, a medium architectural value. It's an old kind of townhouse in Barcelona, and there's multiple different strategies in here. Intervention, coexistence, integration. You'll see it's a kind of beautiful project. It's complicated site. So some of the site is kind of, not there, been demolished. Some of the site is there. They've, retained some things. They've taken other things out. So you can see these two views from either side of the site looking down. You can see these huge kind of timber beams. Keep an eye on those because you'll see those in a couple of slides time. So they've retained some things, but then they've cleared other things out. So it's one of those very, you know, complex kind of projects by Enrique Morales. And if you know anything by Enrique Morales, you'll know that his plans are very kind of, they're like artworks effectively. But the thing, I'll draw you to a couple of things is, you can see around where the masonry, the windows are, and there's a little courtyard, so you can see where the existing building is. And it's just these endless layers that are layered up and cutting away of things and layering new things up. So the little arrow where I've got there, you can see, this is the kind of, the value of the building. So it's somewhere in that kind of middle. The other thing I'll draw your attention to is you can see where the windows are. You get these rectangle spaces or drawings lines, and those are where he's mapped out where the sun path is, and he's let in tiles kind of, into the floor. So I would say this project is a kind of masterclass in sort of excavating layers of age, the patina that comes with age, texture, surfaces, objects, all kind of existing in this almost like this huge kind of film set. It's hugely kind of eclectic, complex, rich, brave. It feels effortless, but it's not.
I think
Layered.
what's interesting as well, Craig, if you go back to the plan for 1 minute, just as again a kind of counterpoint from the last project we were looking at, whereas the last project was completely orthogonal, followed the grain of the building, followed the geometry of the building. As you can see on this plan, it's doing exactly the opposite. The geometry of the interventions is counterpointing, is well, contrasting at every possible juncture with the geometry of the existing building. It's very much part of the Morales mode of operation really to um, put these series of inflected shapes in, changing the qualities of the spaces throughout, changing the quality of the movement through the building. So this is kind of really transformational in a spatial way.
So we move through these fairly quick, um, because
Those
the
are kind of extraordinary interiors, aren't they? Because again, you can see how these new screens, they're clearly set apart from the original structure. They hover slightly below the line of the original joists. And as you say, Craig, they're almost like stage sets in a way that they are placed within there, and they completely change the spatial quality of the original building. So whilst you see the quality of the enclosure, the quality of the undersides of the soffits and the walls, etc. The original spatial configuration is completely transformed. It's a really interesting kind of way of attacking a building.
I've lost hours looking at Morales' plans, trying to work out exactly what he's drawing. Um, exactly that, Paul. They describe it as a sort of chessboard where there's things that are set. So you can see these tiles on the floor here that are kind of mapped out, chalked out around where the sun comes through that particular window. And then these extraordinary kind of objects, some of them functional, some of them not, some of them kind of just found, I think, and brought in. And then the excavation on the wall here, taking this thing back, and that's actually a Gothic column that they've excavated, which you'll see on the last slide. And then selecting those paintings next to that texture. It's all very curated, I think. It's like somewhere between a stage set and an exhibition. So you can see what they've done with the existing walls here. They've painted, but they've left sections. Some of the original timber work they painted over the top, but only a strip. So they've done all these extraordinary ways of actually, interacting with the host building.
It's almost like a collage technique, isn't it? And you can see in the image on the left that the space is clearly legible. I don't think he's done much to that space. He's done a lot to the wall surfaces, but not much to the space. Whereas the previous ones, in order to get any idea of the original space, he'd set the partitions down from the soffit line. So the only way you could read the original space is by looking over the top, if you like, of the inserted partitions. It's interesting that the floors, I mean, I'm not familiar with the detail of the scheme, but they all look new. They all look like replaced and highly finished and highly polished timber.
Yeah. Just the fact that this one really feels like a stage set to me. It feels like there's a play about to happen. And then the top right chair where they've left exactly that wall and filled a few things, sanded a bit off. So there's this kind of interplay between the layers and layers of kind of time, and some things
If
they've
we go
left.
back to that last one again, because again, the thing that's going on spatially, I can see what's going on kind of in terms of the leaving the marks of the original building, but in terms of what's going on spatially, again, the interventions are set down, looks like they're set down at the level of door head height.
Yeah.
So again, although there's a huge kind of complexity of kind of manipulation of an object going on at the low level, the original space is then clearly legible at the upper level. It seems like three levels of space in here. You can see the space that stops at the door head, and then there's another which almost looks like a handrail level above, and then you come up to the ceiling. And some of those spaces seem to cut back into the surface, and some are mounted onto the surface. There's a highly kind of interactive process between the new and the old going on,
Yeah.
like the one agitating the other.
Yeah, and it's constant, Paul, as well. You get the sense that they've lived this space, um, and every kind of where you look, there's something else going. So it's almost like here's an area, I'm going to look at this and do something, but also having a sense of the bigger picture of this kind of chessboard, as they describe it, with all these layers upon layers.
I think when you say it's lived, and I think probably, there's it's the kind of coming back to how you might kind of teach interior architecture, there's almost like a limitation here that you'd almost have to be in this space, stripping it back
Yeah.
and seeing what's there, and then in some ways kind of reacting to what you find, which is, as far as I know, is beyond the scope of anything that can be done in, schools of design or schools of architecture. You can't actually replicate this kind of degree of intervention and kind of intimacy of space in a way.
Yeah, that's exactly that. Even like chalking on the floor where the sun comes in and then them being the tiles, understanding what was behind this stuff when they start to excavate it. There's a kind of archaeology in here that is beyond most projects unless you have the time to invest. Like I said, I described it as a labor of love. And this is that space where you see those kind of columns, and the way that this is worked is kind of extraordinary. So there's these layers on the floor where you got the tiles, and then he's built this tiny little kind of staircase that kind of sneaks up the existing building, which you're rubbing against the kind of texture of that is so tight across this tiny little walkway, and up and around you'll see on the slides, and just the massive objects cluttered underneath that bit. It's kind of
I
extraordinary.
assume the floor has been removed and those beams are just sort of remaining. Is that
Yeah, so
what's
that first
below? Do you
shot,
know,
remember,
Craig?
they were just floating in space outside. It's beautiful. So then when you go up, this is the view you get. You walk across the little platform, the little kind of, sort of slung little kind of walkway on the top left here, and you come around and look down into that space. And the right-hand space is a little bit kind of higher. So that shot on the left, I think, is probably just through where the railings are. And then you can see these timbers. And again, he's kind of painted bits of the timber. They feel like kind of pencils or something. Do you know what I mean? Every inch of it is kind of considered.
It's incredibly sort of designerly in that respect, isn't it? The kind of way, as you say, it's got an extraordinary intensity to it. And that's kind of an aspect of Morales' work is that it's kind of like there's a sort of relentless
Yeah.
complexity to it, a kind of massive amount of ideas taking place in these small spaces. You see it again in the Scottish Assembly building. There's so much going on visually in that building. There's more going on in this because it's a smaller set of spaces, so it's even more potent in some respects.
I mean, even that canopy, I think, has been selected because of what's going on in that existing wall on the right-hand image. You can just see a stonework of some almost arch-like form that is given the idea that this canopy should be this. So it's constant kind of relating back to the existing kind of building. And then as a final slide for this
And
one,
that and that's running counter to the axis of the pool as well.
yeah, it's all those kind of complexities. And then exactly what you just talked about there, this kind of, this archaeology outside the building, as you can see on the left hand kind of image here, but also inside the building. So that Gothic arch, you can see there's this kind of, shape of an angel with its index finger pointing to its heart. And I bet they got super excited when they saw that. Do you know what I mean? And they've just left that with this line coming up of the plaster or paint or whatever that is over the surface. So it's extraordinary. I mean, I love it, but it wears me out. It's so much complexity and richness. I
A lot going on. It's quite interesting to speculate. I mean, I'm sure if the first scheme, the church scheme that you've shown, that if Morales had done that intervention, I feel positive it would still be with all this kind of angularity and movement, etc. He would not have settled for the very calm, kind of orthogonal, quite simple intervention of the last project. It's not in his, or was not in his nature. Of course, he died tragically young, didn't he? He was in his mid-40s or something when he died.
yeah. So moving away from that sort of design strategy, this house building is very much at the lower end of architectural value. This is a collaboration between a bunch of creatives, graphic designers, architects, and actors, and that kind of thing. Is a kind of collaboration. So you can see from the building, it's kind of nicely kind of proportioned, but it's nothing particularly special. And effectively, kind of what they've done here is they've sort of surgically kind of cut back and sort of stripped out the existing building inside, and they have basically covered the whole of the kind of the walls in this kind of grey plastered kind of finish. It's almost like a feels a little bit like an architectural cave to me when I kind of look at it when you see the AXO in a minute, with a dark resin floor. And the rest really is about the objects that sit on that floor. So you'll see there's some furniture, there's the bar, and the back bar, and then this huge sculptural piece up above, which effectively they say is temporary. So if somebody comes up with another idea, they just take that one out and they put it back in. So it's very much a kind of temporary piece of artwork in there, but it's the major thing, and it moves towards the back bar, and there's the classic move of having the mirror so the thing goes off into kind of infinity.
I think this is a really interesting little scheme, because to me this is the real kind of terrain of what was perhaps called, interior design in that sense. And we can talk about these sort of definitions in a way. But yeah, I remember sort of talking to, the lovely Jake Morton, and he used to do work not entirely like this, but using kind of rough plaster work, lining the buildings with Carlite and polishing it up, etc. And it's very designerly, and it's kind of, as you say, look, it could be a kind of interior that's fashionable, and it's kind of ripped out after sort of 5 or 6 years, and then someone comes in and it refits it. I remember talking about the idea of how long things last, and graphics has got the biggest turnaround. Things last for a few days maybe, or a few weeks, and then the graphics train moves on. And interiors like this might not last a long time. They might be gone within a few years. And then the other end of the scale, the big church intervention, well, that's going to be around quite a while, one imagines. So there's a degree of what's ephemeral, what's moves on, and it's to do with cost as well. But this is an interesting little scheme because it's something we talked about a lot when we were, teaching on the interior architecture course, which is about how do you get some atmosphere into a scheme? How do you generate something that's very specific and has a great deal of character and has a kind of presence, even through this fairly lightweight intervention in many respects. It's done with paint, it's done with plasterboard as far as I can see, and then, all the walls are lined out. What is interesting is why it has this kind of rough textured finish. I can't see anything of the existing building remaining. It's all been completely lined out with new materials. Not that that's a bad thing, but if it was being done maybe this year, there might have been some kind of little play on retaining some aspects of the existing building, even if it's of poor quality.
Yeah, as I say, it feels very surgical, especially when you see the axonometric. They like the sharp lines, and then they've got this, like I said, this almost like architectural kind of cave, and this kind of finish to the wall, which they describe it, the thing as a kind of black box theatre, with this speckled blend of plaster and black house paint. They describe it. So there's this, quite esoteric kind of surface, but you're right. This is why this is a kind of, I had this under the kind of veiled, concealed end of the kind of design strategy, because it's the spaces are there, but actually there's not a single surface that you can see compared to the other two schemes where you see all the surface, and Morales is ones of revealing the stuff he wants, to this being completely kind of covered, and it's all about the kind of the objects in there and the atmosphere that they give.
But as well, this building, maybe it's not a particularly kind of high quality building to begin with, whereas the Morales one obviously had some just extraordinary stuff
Yeah.
within it, from different ages. I don't know what the age of that building is, but clearly it had kind of layers of history, whereas this being maybe just a standard unit in a building, if you're working with a building, sometimes there is something that's worth retaining, sometimes there isn't. I mean, I saw a curious scheme in a journal recently where someone has kind of taken the unfinished thing as far as they can, and they hacked the plaster off the wall to reveal sort of fairly crude blockwork, and taken great sort of care to show where the chasing of the electrics was. And I thought, oh, that's kind of, is that taking that idea too far? Are they chased out electrics? Is that something of the memory of the building that is worth preserving? Or do we just say, okay, anything that you judge is worth preserving, you preserve,
Yeah.
part of the character?
Yeah. So in this one, the lighting was all ripped out too, and so the lighting is placed into to uplight and then bounce back down, from the canopy. So you can see that the rest of the interior is pretty straightforward, simple kind of timber and metal kind of furniture in there. It's very kind of arty, given the owners, and this is the toilet, so you go downstairs underneath, sort of where the bar counter is, and then you have this almost like Donald Judd kind of sculpture in the middle of it. And then again, they've stripped everything back, applied that kind of finish to all the surfaces, and then that utilitarian of I need this here drill, let's put it in, which is a whole aesthetic to it, but it's an interesting way of how your strategies for that particular house building when it's low architectural value. So that conversation about how far you take it, if it's not this beautiful stone angel emerging out of the wall, compared to a bit of conduit, where's the sliding scale of that? But an interesting kind of project. And the
Very
last
atmospheric, isn't it? It's really
Mm.
very atmospheric.
And the last slide to answer some of that questions you said, this is what it looked like
Oh,
before
right.
it done. So they pretty much stripped all the surfaces out. So those columns in the middle were clad with kind of mirror. The back bar and the bar pretty much is exactly the same, to be honest. And there was this more skeletal sculpture in the ceiling, which maybe that was an inspiration. But literally they've gone in like locusts, and gone taken everything out and the surface, surgically cut all that out, and then applied that finish. So it's a kind of, as you say, 3-5 years, let's start again.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? I've not seen that slide before, and that's really quite useful to see it, because that's a very distinct interior as well. And the way that they've utilized the mirrors to try and almost kind of visually regularize the space. I've seen it done a number of times where people put a highly polished stainless steel or a mirror onto columns to just try and visually take them out of the space effectively. But it's amazing how different that space is, and I kind of that's as I say, that's the real realm of interior design. If you're kind of moving towards interior design, if we think of the first church intervention as moving perhaps towards kind of big scale architecture, this is all about manipulating surfaces, putting interesting objects within there, sort of very designerly approach. And I think that's one of the things that is very different between perhaps an architectural education, interior design education, is that interior design starts perhaps from the kind of the close up, the tactile, the materials, the kind of atmosphere that's created, whereas architecture tends to start from big organizational moves, kind of working down. Well, I've always felt that. I don't know if it's accurate, but I suppose that's been my perception of what's going on.
Yeah, well, we'll return to that on the next kind of project.
Be
So
interesting to know. Maybe people strongly disagree with that.
yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see, we've got a Q&A after, see what people think. So that's that. Those were dealing with, host building and site from kind of high architectural value all the way to low architectural value, and how the strategies that you put in place are kind of born out of those particular kind of host buildings. So the next ones are looking at more the kind of design strategy first. So how obviously the house building is still massively important. So the house building and how you kind of integrate your ideas as your design strategies. You can't have one without the other, really. Otherwise, you're just got an empty shell of a building. but we're going to center more on the next three projects here to talk about the design strategy. So on the one end of the spectrum here is the kind of insertion through to the kind of new line in this veiling of the existing building. So you may not even see any of it by the end, and then all the stuff in between of how you kind of coexist and integrate and interventions and all that kind of stuff. So we've got another kind of three projects. So we won't cover the same issues in the same detail. So we'll move quicker through these three, but nonetheless, we need to kind of, talk about, the issues that, we're trying to raise with this one. So the first one in this category is a chapel, it's a home, and it's an insertion. So this is in Australia. That's why we describe this more as a chapel, really. From a Welsh point of view, we have kind of, this is a smaller kind of scale thing, very different scale to the one we just saw in Maastricht. So there it is on its site. It's got a huge kind of site around it. It's got a couple of entrances, but the main entrance is where you can see it indicated there. And so that's it from that main entrance. So you can see already that they've began to sort of change that doorway to change the kind of symmetric sort of quality of what that doorway would be. So you can see inside there is a symmetry, but it's kind of broken up with the masses that they've got into it.
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? If you're doing an intervention into a building, to what degree you signal it from the outside and how you might signal it, because you'll see many churches that have been converted into residential units similar to this, but yeah, they still look like churches. No, the people will maybe even take a great deal of trouble to preserve the exterior, not change it. Whereas obviously this is a very deliberate gesture about, hey, this is new, something different's happening in this place now.
Yeah, and they signal that from the outside, and as you get to the kind of threshold. So here's the kind of axonometric then, so they've exploded, so you can see the kind of you can see into the axonometric, so you can see that from that entrance there's a series of large scale kind of elements again that are kind of holding certain functions, and this one is kind of two layered, so there's a kind of ground floor and an upper floor. And lots of that sort of stuff in the kind of green block at the front end goes up two levels, and then it's lower level stuff as you get deeper into the plan and where the kind of altar is. So you can see that, the shell of the building from the inside on that image on the left-hand side, they've obviously treated that. So they've obviously, treated those timbers. They've, repaired possibly and kind of painted the kind of, the walls underneath it. There's a new floor in here. And they've also, as you saw, kind of treated the outside of the building. So, this is not, they're not taking this thing where it was. They've taken this from a point and they've renovated the whole of the shell inside and out, and then dropped these kind of objects into it.
In many respects, Craig, it's very similar to the intervention of the library in Maastricht. Only this is incredibly axial. The library sort of like moved to one side. This is really striking on the axiality of the building. You see in that slide I focused it is on the main entrance. And what is very curious though, it has the series of towers, a bit like the Maastricht one, and they combine at the upper level again into some kind of horizontal element that pulls them all together. But what is curious about this one, I think, is that the different design language of those towers. So whereas the Maastricht one, it had a very clear design language that went all the way through it. Um, this one's curious because the design language changes within the abstract object that kind of drops into the space. The other things, I mean, again, you can see the floors being completely renewed and looks like the walls have been completely replastered. And there's something very curious going on with the bit of tracery on the right-hand side, which seems to be supported by some kind of lintel device, perhaps with, I don't know, polished stainless steel in the webbing or mirror or something. It sort of makes it look as if the tracery is actually floating there.
Yeah. So they've actually cut through that. So that glass doorway to the side there. If you look at the opposite side, they've obviously cut through that masonry at that level just to get that kind of head height in through there. So that's a really interesting. I'd love to see more detail of that. Kind of have the literally have the kind of junctions and the details of that kind of stonework and this new, obviously there's a structure in there to hold up all that up. So there's a really interesting kind of detail there, and that is literally cutting through that. So there's a church there. I would describe it as kind of the higher level architectural value, but it's obviously not listed, and they've kind of literally kind of laser cut that kind of rectangle out to place that kind of doorway in there. I think it's interesting what you say about the makeup of the towers in here, these large scale elements, because to me, when I saw it first, the colored acrylic is a little nod to the kind of stained glass that you see in the windows. And then this kind of relief, which you'll see a bit more detail in a couple of slides time. The right hand kind of column has this relief pattern in it, and I'm assuming that must be a kind of, again, a nod to the stonework kind of carving kind of detail. So it's like the bookstore's gone, I'm new, and I'm different to the host building. This one, it's taking little bits of references from the shell. That's how I read it anyway, and building it into its own kind of language. Here's the plan, so you can see that linear through the center, as Paul said, across that kind of doorway running right the way through these kind of towers. And above the entrance is the master bedroom, which we'll see in a second. So the towers all build up in the one half of the plan, and then everything else is lower level, where the kind of kitchen is there, in the kind of where the altar would be. There's a couple of sections. So again, you can see the build up of the lounge, dining room, and then kind of bedrooms
But
above, and then
I think what's quite important in this as well is the kind of the fact the space opens up between the two tower elements, much more than in the the library scheme. Now that section kind of undermines it a bit because it's like a suspended roof, really, isn't it? It makes it look like a solid floor running through there, but it's actually only a kind of quite a narrow route that connects the front to the back.
yeah, and then the kitchen being completely open, which you'll see in a second.
Very sculptural, isn't it?
Mm. So that's looking back to the main entrance. You can see that door where they're playing with the kind of symmetrical aspect of the door and the mullions and transoms in there. And that's directly up above is this little walkway that Paul's describing. So if they'd taken the section away from that, it would have looked much more like these kind of towers. But on the last slides, they took the section right the way through the center. So it looks like a solid thing, a whole floor, but it's not. It's just this thin walkway. And so these are very structural. So you can see the structure running through the bookcase that is supporting the bookcase, but actually supporting the floor up above. So this is quite a sculptural thing as well, structural as well. And even the floor kind of underneath that they put in here, kind of, this timber feels like it's the little nod to the timber at high level from the existing building as well. There's that kind of stained glass effect.
There's a lot going on, isn't there? It's kind of it's kind of curious as well, the combination of the fairly orthogonal geometry that's used generally, and then the introduction of that kind of like
Curves.
curved element that's coming in on the library shelf and the furniture.
And
See,
there's
I
the
find this a bit strange that they're using this kind of ornament on the new insertions. I can't quite get my head around that, whether because the rest of it is so abstract, and then they utilize this ornament on the new interventions, which doesn't seem to entirely relate to anything that's going on in the existing building. Maybe
has
it does. Maybe there's something in there that is not clearly visible. It's kind of like it, but not quite.
yeah.
Curious, very curious.
And there's the kitchen where the altar
There's
would.
a lot of different design languages going on, isn't there? With the ornamented facades, the kind of straightforward plasterboard, and then overcladding with metals, etc.
And that's upstairs in the children's bedrooms where you can see that relief pattern again going up to that second level. And then that's the master bedroom with the huge stained glass on the front of the building, and then looking back across the whole scheme towards where the kitchen is.
See, the thing with that is that, and this is a kind of design, I guess. Can you get that? Yeah, it's a sort of design against a kind of architectural strategy to some extent, that if you set up something which is so incredibly strong symmetrically, then it's very curious then to break that through the selection of the materials and the forms and the surfaces, to break it as many times as you can, color as well, of course, sort of set it up and then break it down so powerfully. I mean, it's a curious thing because the axial move is still the most powerful gesture in the whole scheme.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting.
Everything else seems to try and undermine it in some way rather than reinforce it.
Yeah.
That's obviously the game. That's obviously what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that they just trying to take references from the existing building. That's the only way I can kind of read the kind of the thought path. Where's that come from? Where's that come from? Where it must be from an analysis of, well, there's these stonework kind of detail, and well, we'll put that into this cladding. There's the stained glass. Well, we can have the color.
Kind of like modern eclectic.
Yeah, that's the only way I can think about it. So next one. So this is a warehouse, concrete, brutal, kind of raw warehouse that's been turned into apartment. So this is kind of coexisting and kind of integrating into that existing structure. So you can see immediately from this kind of photograph, so it's looking right the way across the apartment, that there's this new lining that's put in, but it's not done what lots of people do, which is basically cover up everything, so cover up the whole of the ceiling, hide those columns away. So there is some value in these, the existing building in this thing is kind of beautiful kind of concrete building in this kind of brutalist kind of way. The heads of these columns are quite a kind of feature. So the designer here has gone, okay, well, we'll reveal this, and so we'll put these layers in, but we'll kind of frame up the existing building, and that happens in a couple of different places. And then new floor, series of quite luxurious kind of objects, walnut and brass kind of linings in there as well.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, there's obviously a real kind of shape making strategy in the interaction between the ceiling and the original concrete soffit. You see this quite a lot as well, where people they have to in some way get services into these spaces, and you can either put them as you did in a previous scheme or showed in the previous scheme, just expose all that galvanized conduit or whatever. Or you can do something like this, and obviously the service runs, the electrical runs, etc., are kind of within the plasterboard areas. You can see where the lights are, everything probably runs through, everything service-wise is probably just running through that area. So there's a functional driver in there as well. It's it yeah, it's a really interesting scheme.
So like the big open space here, and then they have all the accommodation is then built up of the bedrooms on the one side, this L shape all the way to the snug, which you'll see on the kind of plan here. So big open space where the kind of columns are and where the windows are, and then the cellular accommodation then pushed up against the kind of the solid, non kind of windowed kind of walls that you can see there along the top and along the bottom. So big kind of open space. So you can see you enter through, again, this strategy of creating this almost like a large piece of kind of furniture that you're walking through, this kind of walk-in kind of wardrobe thing, which is made out of walnut, which you'll see in a second. And you'll see that they've used that in a really interesting way against the existing building. Do you want to come in on the plan, Paulo?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of would like to see the photograph again because I think all of these partitions they all go up to the soffit from what I can remember of the
Yeah.
they don't kind of allow the soffit to run through. So as you say, they're kind of encrusted onto the back walls of the original one. I'm kind of always find kind of the idea of totally enclosed bedrooms quite oppressive, I must admit, and this seems to feature them.
Well, the one column that interested me most was the one where that bathroom is. So the top kind of right that seems to be
Hmm.
crashing through things, but you'll see it's almost like a character in that space in that kind of bathroom. So this is you coming through the front door through this walnut massive kind of piece of furniture, and you can see now the windows kind of opposite, bringing all that light in. New floor. And then this is looking into that little kind of snug. So this is that kind of walnut that is almost kind of, it's connecting, kind of almost like hugging the existing building.
Oh, so that's very open actually. It's not a partition. It's
Um,
an actual open space
yeah, yeah,
as you look through. Okay.
yeah. But these luxurious kind of objects in front of it. So there's this nice connection between the existing building here. It's not kind of completely covered up. You get this kind of dialogue between this is old, this is new. And then a bit further back, so you can see this huge half a ton concrete kind of tub here with the existing concrete sort of column with all its kind of scars kind of in the background of it. Um, Interesting. So again, new concrete, old concrete. And then even in the mirrors there, you can see the kind of existing concrete kind of behind you. So it's kind of feels like the building is sort of ever present, the host building. So there is it. You can see it kind of in that kind of space. It's almost like a glass case to keep the kind of column in a little bit, with this huge half-ton kind of bathtub. So you can see the walnut kind of huge cabinetry there with the kind of lighting underneath it. And, again, like you were saying, the last thing you want to do is close these spaces off too much. So even the bathroom here in an apartment that you might be the only person in it, this whole thing kind of can slide so that, the space kind of opens up. And I think that's allowing the space, that existing building, to breathe a little bit
Very
rather.
intricate, isn't it? It's very slick. It's a very
Yeah,
sort of slick scheme.
it's very London.
Quite, yeah, yeah.
And there's the kind of sort of the brass work reflecting in that snug area. So you can see some things are really bedded in and integrated in around the kind of edge of it, like this huge kind of walnut kind of cabinetry, and then it allows to breathe in other spaces like the big kind of living room space. There's the other section looking into the kind of bathroom. So that was, that kind of warehouse scheme, kind of medium architectural value, coexisting and integrating in. For the last project here is a kind of commercial unit, low architectural value. At least the designers have decided that with the way they've treated it. And it's a kind of techno bar. And I would call it kind of new lining. So with this one, I'll start in with the plan straight off because, as you'll see, I put the red line in here. So there's a new lining that literally covers everything up. I don't think there's an internal surface that you can actually see from the existing building. So all the analyzing of the existing building has gone into the kind of placements of pushing things to the kind of outside to create this kind of, dance floor in the middle. So you can see the staircases there would be existing. So they've kind of left those be, and then they framed the whole thing in this kind of red surface, which you'll see even the floors. And they've got two bars to the edge here, and then a kind of DJ. So the whole idea with this thing is called Oven Club. So you can see from the shot on the right, it's kind of fairly low architectural value, but they've taken that idea oven and taken that one idea and literally pushed it. That's the idea we've got. So the building almost like is like the casing, outer casing of the oven, and the interior is literally lined like the inside of a kind of oven, in abstract terms. So there's stainless steel,
They've
there's
exposed the soffit though, haven't they? It looks like the
yes,
original soffit there.
there's
So although as you say, the entire wall space is lined, they do kind of reveal. And does it go up tight? I can't quite tell. Looks like there's a bit of a flash gap between the wall lining and the ceiling. Can't quite make it out, but
it's not much if there is one. There might be a shadow gap there, but
yeah,
it's mainly to do with the height, I think, why they've kind of stripped that out and kind of left that kind of
yeah.
industrial is probably the only thing that you see. Everything else, the floor, with this kind of vinyl floor. So if we skip through, you'll see that's the DJ element. This is one of the bar on the right hand side as you come in. So you can see the LED on the top left here comes from the bar right the way across the top. So they've gone for this particular finish, which is called Alpi cladding, I believe, which is this red, black kind of patterned kind of cladding, which is like a more a kind of eco-friendly kind of veneer.
But this is really kind of, again, it's a very atmospheric kind of design, isn't it? I mean, it's trying to and succeeding in, I think, creating a very distinct atmosphere. You go in there and you've kind of arrived at somewhere that has that kind of very different ethos. And again, it's a very interior design approach. Taking that interior, manipulating the surfaces primarily, not as far as I can tell, making kind of huge spatial interventions. In fact, probably neutralizing the space a little bit by the way that it's lined. You can see even on the where the bar is, it's essentially bringing forward the back wall. It's not trying to change the geometry of the space in any way whatsoever. It's just inserting that rather nice kind of stainless steel bar, and it's kind of strange because apart from the rather gaudy pattern, it's an incredibly minimalist design, So it's the pattern really that's giving its distinction, along, I suggest, with the lighting. The lighting is so distinct as well.
Yeah, well, the lighting picks up on those kind of filaments, and again,
Yeah.
inside Evan, I think they talk about, the material palette here, particularly that Alpi cladding, I think is what they call it. It's a particular type of veneer. They talk about flames and burning and heat and melting, and to take that whole analogy further of what the actual function is, they describe, this is a place where temperatures rise, materials transform, and everything vibrates with intensity. As you say, it's a kind of three-dimensional branding for this club, isn't it? It's memorable.
Shall we throw it open? See if anyone has any questions, like to contribute something?
Yeah, so that's the final slide. So there is Evan in full action. So if you do want an hour worth of a techno set there, you can press that that link and you'll have it. So yeah, let's open it up to
That's me organized for later.
any questions.
There's an interesting photography museum in Maastricht as well
Okay.
that I saw at the same time.
Ah, you saw both of them.
Yeah, I went last year.
What was it like to walk up the top and get up into that mural, that
Oh, it
space?
was great. It was really good. Yeah,
I
yeah.
bet.
And well, it was just, and it felt a bit odd just having lines of books right by you as well, that high.
How high did the books go then? Because they look like they're well above your head height.
Oh, do you mean on each level?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So they go up high,
Yeah.
when you're on that level, can you reach the top
Oh,
shelf?
yeah, but each level was, you could get your hand to it.
Okay.
But then there's the next level
Yeah,
because
yeah,
there's about 3 levels to it, isn't there? I think.
yeah. Three. Yeah. It's pretty extraordinary, I think.
It's lovely to hear you two again, and just hear you talking about, some lovely projects and describing them in a way which is familiar and it's always lovely to hear. I suppose the question I was going to sort of lob at you was that Paul, I think, said earlier something really, really fascinating, which has struck a chord in my brain, which is you talked a little bit about, I think what you've been describing in many respects is a sort of sensibility, which I think was definitely implanted in the program in Cardiff and subsequently for many years since. I know for myself personally, and hopefully for many other people on the call. And it's a sensibility which is, like you say, is difficult to it's difficult to do because it's so hands-on. So when we used to go on site visits, when we go on site visits now, etc., or when we were students, let's say, or we were taking our students on site visits, we couldn't get a hammer out and knock a bit of plaster off or get your finger under something or pull at it. I mean, you could, but we'd normally get lobbed out of the site and people would be annoyed at us, really. So this whole thing is all about simulation in a way. This sensibility of simulating a sense of the building, a kind of a desire to get under the skin of it, to sort of forensically analyze and synthesize this material. And I suppose the question, if there is one after this long introduction, is just about how do we, do you think we can teach this? I think we can, but I mean, I'm interested to hear what you two guys have got to think about that.
Do you want to go first, Paul? Because I know we did talk about it. So I think we're both on the same page. Do you want to go first, Paul?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting. It's great because it's kind of like it's the limitations of teaching in a way, and the limitations of how you can, to some extent, replicate things you experience in practice and convey them to a point of teaching. And I suppose in the worst kind of instances, you kind of have people when you put forward a program or a building, etc., and the immediate response is to treat it like a shell, a kind of container, and have no kind of response to the character or the construction or anything. So that's a kind of at one end, at one end of the scale in a sense. I suppose there is another one slightly lower than that, which is when someone has not actually been in the interior of a building and they're to use your word, simulating not only the procedure, if you like, of knowing the building, but actually simulating what might be in it, as it were. And we've both been in situations where we've been presented with that, perhaps with some photographs to accompany, or perhaps not even, perhaps not even. So that's at kind of one end of the scale. The other end, though, that when you kind of, as you describe it so eloquently, to get your fingers on this, to touch it and feel it and get involved with the fabric of it, I think it's probably really a difficult thing to do. It's what Fred Scott refers to, what we all refer to as, what happens when you strip out a building, when you go and you strip out and you really find what that building's like, sort of below the accretion of years, etc., buildings that have been hacked around. I mean, I've been into buildings, I'm sure you have, and kind of by the time they've been stripped out, I didn't recognize what I went into in the first place when all the suspended ceilings and stud work of ages has been pulled out. And, I've been in buildings where it's been utterly magical. I think, Jesus God, is that what it was like underneath all of this rubbish that's been put in for kind of years and years? So I don't think you can kind of replicate it to that degree. I'd be interested to know, because you've been teaching this intensively for a lot longer than I have, and I'd be interested to know if you think it can be replicated, or, as you use the word, simulated to such an extent.
I think we can simulate it. We can't. I don't think we can replicate it. I think you're right, unless you're doing it per se. But I think what I've managed to, if I've perfected anything in all these years, and I wouldn't even say the word perfect, but I think over the years, I've developed processes and projects and ideas and things which are very almost hyper kind of attenuated versions of developing this sensibility to get students and anybody involved in the project to become super curious and attuned to the unusual qualities or any qualities of buildings and spaces, however minor in a way. So I've been doing a lot of work with students recently where we don't even introduce program until much later in the process to sort of keep that out of the way for a while, and instead begin with this kind of forensic investigation of a building, which is not just logical. I think working with postgraduate students, we inherit a bunch of things which are quite often very good, and then some habits which are not so good. And somehow a lot of the habits are logic based, let's say, rightly so. But what happens is intuition and other things, and sort of, you know, atmospheres and things that are less sort of easy to analyze and to rationalize, let's say, get put by the wayside. And I think we try and bring those back a little bit. So I suppose in short, I've been trying for years to kind of hit this sweet spot where people would trust their intuition a little bit more, but also create these hyper kind of attenuated processes for people to really forensically get under the skin of a building, even though they can't per se with a hammer, but somehow to try to either imagine or to develop narrative or to develop atmosphere or interest or sensibility around the things that exist, really. And that's why I'm really interested in this, because I think it's, you know, in sort of relation to what you've just said about some of the kind of worst aspects of it. I was at the Venice Biennale earlier in the year, and I saw things now which I find slightly disturbing, and I've seen it a number of times now. And I hate to generalize, but I do think it's actually an architectural practice or an architectural education trope, which is where these guys are getting into the idea of reuse. And let's face it, they've only done it in the last few years, really, where they're almost kind of fetishizing things and treating the building as heroic.
Yeah.
So the Danish pavilion, if you go to the Venice Biennale or if you've seen it, there's this incredible space where they're almost fetishizing the material. There's this film of sort of almost heroic qualities of people, you know, digging holes in the ground, and builders with their shirts off, kind of rubbing themselves with bits of concrete and stuff. And you just think, it's just a film with somebody digging a hole in the ground, you know what I mean? And it's going that way, in a way where people almost fetishize stuff to the point of where they want to retain everything, and somehow everything has a heroic quality.
I
And
think that's really interesting, because I kind of agree. I think there is a kind of, at the moment, and you're right, it's come into architecture, because what's interesting is that we were kind of dealing with these things, you know, like 20 years ago. But it is new to the field of architecture in many instances. It is quite recent. There's some instances that were, I think, kind of breakthrough in architecture, thinking of the theatre in Sloane Square, you know, which was done up and stripped down, and it was kind of a powerful gesture of that kind of unfinished. But I think there is a cult of the unfinished. I think you're right, and I was alluding to this scheme that I saw, which I thought was quite sort of slightly ludicrous, really, where someone had magically uncovered a bit of chasing in a breeze block, you know, and you think, well, and what that suggests to me is a kind of the thing as an operation, rather than the word that you use, the thing as a sensibility about what do you want to reveal about the building? Why do you want to reveal it? Now, in the Morale scheme we looked at, there was a real kind of clear position about what should be retained, what should be revealed, how it should be retained, whether it's kind of unmasked in a way, or, you know, whether it's framed in some way or whatever. Whereas there is this sort of desire to, I don't know, just, you should reveal it, you know, whatever it's like, you know, even if it's a bit of concrete with a bit of rebar sticking out of it, you know, that's, and it kind of, before you know it, all the interiors start to look like, I don't know, kind of bars in Manchester from 15 years ago, you know what I mean? It's kind of public buildings start to look, I think, what, really? You know, what's that about?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think there is it's for want of a better word, it's become stylized in that sense. I think you're right. But I do like your idea of the cultivation of a sensibility. I think that's really interesting about how people could approach buildings, what they need to look at, how they value them, what they understand about them, which I think is the way that we used to try and teach.
Yeah.
I don't know, to what degree of success, but I think, that's what we try to communicate. There's certain things that you can clearly take, as you say, the logic side of it, what the rhythm of the structure is like, what the volume is like, and so on and so forth. But there is an element, I agree, that goes beyond that, and which is about sensibility, which is about intuition, those kind of words that you use. And they're the most difficult things, I think, to perhaps engage students with, or kind of, because sensibility is just so fundamental to anyone involved in design, architecture, anything with a visual kind of world. It's so important, and yet you'll never see it. I don't think I've ever seen it in a kind of handbook or a course descriptor or a module descriptor. Cultivate let a criteria basis is how you demonstrate your sensibility. I mean,
Yeah, no, I agree. We've currently been putting things like that into our the dreaded learning outcomes, where we use the word experimentation and risk, and I don't think they're the same as sensibility, but I think there's something in that which we try to demonstrate, that we value those dimensions, really. The less, let's say, the less logical, let's say. But anyway, no, I think it's definitely something I learned in Cardiff, or at least I might have had some clues about it before I was teaching there, but I definitely helped the years I was there with you and everybody, and Patrick and Mike and so on, and everybody really helped me to sharpen that, for sure, or to understand what it was I was saying to students a bit more, for sure.
Well, I think we were all trying to discover what this discipline kind of interior architecture is about, because we were the first school to implement a course under that title. And, it was in an art school, and it came out of that great interior design kind of culture. And, from my point of view, it was kind of perhaps bringing some techniques of architectural organization, or back into that kind of context. But like you, I learned a terrific amount from operating, within that milieu with that group of people, including yourself, and even Craig here.
Well, I think we mapped that out a little bit in the podcast one, where we did the kind of legacy of Michael Fleetwood, and picked up some of those kind of core things that we all, his legacy, that we kind of carry on into the kind of future. But to come back to your original question, I agree with everything both of you just said. I think the closest that you can get to having a student not just simulate it, but actually really get under the plaster and get their fingers on it, was a student, Sarah McCall Morgan, that used her parents' building for her final project, which is this beautiful kind of warehouse building. And she could visit it, sit in it, and do all the things that clearly Morales did in that space. Other than that, it's quite difficult because of access to buildings. It's getting more and more kind of difficult, I would say. But certainly you can do it as a practitioner, but it's a lot more effort.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that's interesting, I think, what Graham raises, is that kind of, that idea of sensibility. But there are some buildings that are really do not have any particular strong character to them, so you kind of have to import the ethos, if you like, and trying to somehow masquerade that, these things constructed in kind of poor materials, which were always intended to be covered up, and when they're revealed, they're not particularly attractive in many instances anyway. You could say, well, it's authentic, it's real, it's you can use all of those things. But then if you have a building which has got historical layers to it, then there's far more potential to kind of explore those ideas of, revealing the building. So I think the age of the building has a big impact, when you see kind of people struggling to make something fantastic out of a 2005 shop unit or something. I mean, there's sort of limitations. There's not a great deal to work with in that sense. So, buildings offer different potentials to engage with in the way that we've talked about.
I
think
think it's building per building, isn't it? You have to. You can't just apply the same thinking. That's why you analyze it rigorously, because there may be nothing, as you say, that is of merit. So you end up with the kind of the Avon scheme of the
Yeah, which is a kind of legitimate response in that instance, to
which is why we show
reconfigure it and
those.
impose an identity on it, because it might not have any particular identity. But I mean, I remember we used to discourage students from, say, taking on listed buildings because they were so inhibiting, so difficult to intervene in, and especially highly cellular buildings were, kind of listed buildings. The ones that were interesting, I think, were the kind of Victorian warehouse type ones that had quite a lot of character, quite nice material base to them, um, and they could be worked with in perhaps the manner that we like, or we feel that there's most potential in. Yeah.
just to add to that, the banal is, the spatial banal, let's say the building banal, as it were. I think is equally as valid as some of the examples that we've shown, which have qualities and so on and so forth, and arguably is a sort of logic or a style or a typology, which I think we're all dealing with so much more now. I mean, for instance, we just did a project last year with the students on a 1980s Terry Farrell spec office in Canary Wharf, and the project approach was literally that. This is a banal 1980s sort of wafer thin postmodern skin on a steel frame, which offers arguably nothing in the traditional sense of reusing buildings, let's say, that have value and that have heritage or that have some sort of quality that you want to work with. And so it was a super difficult challenge, actually, and we sort of started to see some really interesting sort of student responses, which were okay, so it's some sort of pastiche of a classical kind of facade that's kind of as thin as a sheet of paper, really. It's a kind of masking a traditional steel frame, although actually the steel frame was quite irregular when we started to analyze it. But anyway, the point was that the banal, as it were, I think what it does is that when you reuse, you accept that, and then, as I think you just said, Paul or Craig, I can't remember, but you sort of start to inject, or you layer on a new identity, which may well derive some of its properties from that, or you just override it and say, okay, I'm going to give you an identity which was, might go forward for the next 10, 5, 20, 100 years or whatever. But I suppose my point is I think this is a kind of, it's easy, it's not easy, but it's kind of accepted that the kind of value of the heritage site, let's say, gives us so much stories and things to hang our hats on. But I think we've also got to really get used to these kind of pastiche, banal things which are of very recent. Because let's face it, demolition is not going to be an option, I would say, arguably in the very near future, if not now. And
No, I agree. Yeah.
Learning to do stuff with these things is critical, I think.
I think though it's a different kind of challenge though, isn't it? When you've got an historical building,
Yeah.
got something that you can reveal aspects of that building. When you've got something that, as you describe it, is a simply banal interior, then it demands a different kind of response, whether it's imposing another stronger identity upon it, whether it's actually accepting the banality of it and making some kind of surreal gesture towards it, which accepts and somehow inflates the banality, if you like. I mean, but you've got to take but it's a different kind of position that you have to take to it, I would suggest.
Yeah, for sure.
To work with, where, I mean, as you know, I do a lot of work with schools, and I'm involved with so many schemes now, which is basically about remodeling, renewing school buildings. Whereas I could guarantee that 10, 15 years ago, these buildings I'm working with would have probably been demolished and replaced. So it's a different culture that we're working within.
But also your opinion and our opinions of a 1980s, whatever it might be, is completely different from my 18 and 19-year-old son's opinion of a 1980s building. Do you know what I mean? It's that's a factor too, do you know what I mean? You know, like it or not, you know.
So we're talking about your music taste there, or we're talking about buildings, Craig?
Both. We got 1 minute left. Has anybody got another quick question before we wrap it up?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was I think I graduated in 2000, interior architecture, and I did architecture for 10 years, and then I retrained to become a stonemason. I think partly because I was so drawn to like that tactile pulling apart of a building, and I've ended up now doing a renovation in France. We're partway through, and we've been doing it for 5 years, and we've pulled the building apart. It's parts of it's fallen apart, and we've had to build it up quickly. And it's been a really interesting process of it being totally out of our control. And now we're sort of left with this building with many scars and many layers of time. Some old, some new, some regretful, some joyful. But yeah, it's just really interesting. I'm finding this revisitation of interior architecture, you guys popping up, really interesting timing for me, because I've got this massive puzzle of a building to try and turn into a house. So yeah, it's anybody want to come over and give me a hand?
That sounds really exciting.
Sounds like a really amazing project, Laura. And what a journey from architecture through stonemasonry and then now this renovation. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
fantastic.
It's interesting. Yeah, you'd think I was quite well equipped for this stage, but actually I just feel completely overwhelmed by it. But it's interesting listening to you, because I feel like if I can sort of follow the threads back to what you were teaching us, I might find a bit of a solution there. So
are you there now?
Yes, yeah.
Can you turn the camera around so we can see it?
My camera's terrible. It's full of stone dust. It's terrible. So I'm sorry, I can't. But
it is a sort of slightly blurred image. It is stone dust, is it?
Yeah, it is stone dust. So, but I have got stuff on Instagram. There's stuff on there if you wanted to look me up
fantastic.
on there. But yeah, it's definitely a work in progress.
Laura,
it's lovely to see you.
Laura, yeah, remind us of your project in 2000.
Oh God, I can't even remember. Oh God,
I can't make you out with your blurry camera, but I must have taught you. Paul and I must have taught you.
Yeah. Well, I think I was supposed to graduate in 1999, but I had to delay. So I think you taught us a little bit, Graham, but not a lot. So you might have been a little bit later.
Story of my life.
But no, it was a spa project in an old bank in Cheltenham. So it was very circular.
I remember it.
I recall.
I do too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember it. Yeah, I was there. No, this is how much of an impression I made on you. I was there 97 to 2004.
No, I do remember you.
Probably me. Well,
was I saying these days, Graham? That they remember you.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Paul and I are saying things like, "What are you doing a circular building?"
Probably.
Sounds like us, Paul. I think.
Yeah.
Great to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks, Laura. I'll message you. I wouldn't mind seeing this on Instagram. It sounds exciting.
Okay.
Okay, let's
You're doing proper stuff, Laura. You're doing proper stuff.
All right, thank you, everybody. Take care. See you in the next one.